Your Royal Majesties, Princes and Princesses, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, you'll kindly permit me to use the text in the interest of time. Instead of speaking freestyle, I'll only speak as I wrote. The other permission I seek from you is that we see ourselves in this whole as the Africans living today but walking on the shoulders of the great mummies and daddies that lived thousands of years before. That every step we take, we owe it to the people that lived on this continent way before we were even biological substances. That said, I would like to pay special thank you to Dr. Lita, who this morning started by saying and brandishing the African People's Human Rights Convention, which the African Union, or the Organization of African Unity signed in 1981. Because the subject I was invited to speak to you about is entitled Indigenous, Colonial, and Post-colonial Governance Systems in Africa, a critical evaluation through the human rights prism. We're going to talk the things we talk against what human rights are. Again, we heard her say that human rights, indeed probably even more pronouncedly, the general, the son of Africa from the diaspora, the historical diaspora, said, issues of human rights are not things we are going to be taught, because human rights were invented over 5,000 years before Europeans came to Africa by our grandparents. And we are going to speak the way we speak through the glasses, through the spectacles of human rights. This is my statement. It's necessary to start this discussion with the very word, or defining the very word, governance. What are we talking about when we say governance? Now, in the context of Africa, most of us Africans will generally know and associate the adjective African values or systems with unsophisticatedness, primitivity, backwardness, and altogether lacking in quality or value when you talk about something African. When you talk about local products, people are disappointed. They want something imported because things African have been made to look mediocre. From this presentation, the adjective refers to governance that prevailed in Africans for their people, as I said, going back 5,000 years ago, 5,000 years before Christ was born. It's a fact that history, as taught in our schools, designed by the very people who enslaved and then later colonized our people, purposely excluded anything of value about Africa that took place before Europeans came on the scene. The days when everything taught was taken for gospel truth from Europe have long gone. More than 500 years ago, before Europeans arrived, embarking on what they called civilizing Africa. The Berlin Conference was ostensibly mounted to come and colonize Africa. But 500 years before that, there is one traveler, Ibn Battuta. He was a journalist, a geographer. And this is what he wrote about what existed in Africa 500 years before Europeans came to the continent. The black people possess some admirable qualities. They are seldom unjust and have a great abhorrence of injustice than any other people. Their sultan, meaning the king, shows no mercy to anyone who is guilty of the least act of insolence vis-à-vis values. There is complete security in the countries. Neither traveler nor the inhabitants themselves need fear anything about robbers or violence. These black people do not confiscate property of any foreigner, and even when the foreigner dies, they will keep the property until the kinsmen come for it. That was Africa 500 years before Europeans came to the continent. Now, Sheikh Anta Diop, those who are familiar with the literature in French know Sheikh Anta Diop was an African anthropologist, a polyvalent scientist, was fighting when he wanted to prove that Egyptians were blacks, Africans. But the Western world, because they did not accept that Africans can also have brains like white beings, refused, because those pyramids could not have been built by somebody not white. The incredible genius which the West grudgingly sought to accord to Egypt was premised on a racially divorcing approach that Egyptians were whites. Yet this African genius, which was equivalent, if not superior, had already created their own governance norms. For example, in 1235, the emperor of Mali at that time, Sundiata Keita, issued a charter of human rights, the Kurkanfuga Charter, or the Manden Charter on human rights. And so we do not have to go for lessons from the Western world, who themselves in the same year talk about Magna Carta in England. But the emperor, Sundiata Keita, had a huge, almost all the northern part of Africa, and he issued a Charter of Human Rights that had 42 articles. And if you look at that, which existed, and contrast it with what Europeans had, you know the superiority in terms of brain work our ancestors had. Africans developed governance codes based on devout spirituality, which kings and queens were role models in their societies. Strict adherence to ethics, solidarity, honesty, thrifty, fairness, hard work, and fraternity, coupled with respect, trust, kept societies together through hard and pleasant times. The golden rule concept is traced to African pharaohs. And we are going to find out that the African pharaohs were actually black Africans. But about the strength of spirituality in African leadership was commented on in 384 and again 322 by two European scholars, Diodore of Sicily during the first era before Christ and Aristotle. What did they say? They wrote this about African spirituality in leadership. For the nomination of kings, the priests make a first list of the best of society. Then from this, the one that God has picked via a process in accordance with certain rites, the people make him their king. In fact, his powers are conferred to him by the divine decision. That's how leadership in Africa was. That when you are entrusted with authority, you exercise it in fairness, with a heart, because you are God's own image. The other one wrote, to his subjects, or to her subjects, the appointed does not act arbitrarily, but he conducts or she conducts his conduct he conducts himself subject to ancestral and customary laws and does no favor outside the law. That is the strictness of African leadership. You can't harm your society if you go according to the traditions of African leadership. It would be a big omission not to state that spirituality significantly characterizes political powers exercised by the highest level down to the smallest in society. Again, I'm going to go back to our brother from the to the historical diaspora. We have written work by Chancellor Williams, who was a great historian who wrote The Destruction of African Civilization. Chancellor Williams. Then Walter Rodney, who wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And finally, in my own life, I've met a white archaeologist, Charles Bonnet. This one is Swiss, who after 56 years of excavation in archaeology in South Sudan, in Sudan, argues that Africans are different from other people because they are very spiritual. These are people that have done research, have reflected, and I told you, we stand on shoulders of great men who lived before us. Now, denying African knowledge that would waken them up and make them become proud of their heroic, creative valor has kept even the elite allegedly blind and asleep to this day. Some of our people, they're very highly educated, because they've been fed on nonsense and lies, will disappoint you when they open their mouths. However, thanks to unprecedented progress in technology, a few right-thinking scientists the world over are rising against injustice in the dissemination of truth on ancient Africa as a big actor in human history, and our ancestral indisputable leadership in spirituality, science, governance, and every other sphere of endeavor are coming true. Africa's great historians, anthropologists all-rounder, Cheikh Anta Diop, I mentioned above, was mentioned earlier. Fortunately, we have a name of the Afrocentric fellow scientist who is following the steps of Cheikh Anta Diop, because he was born 10 years after Cheikh Anta Diop, and that's the man I mentioned, Charles Bonnet. And of course, we are talking about reviving Africa's ancient values. And you say, why do you bring in this white person now when you're saying we should just look to ourselves? In my writing, I've said, copying is what God gave us. When a baby is born in the family, After 2 years, he begins to speak like the mother and father. That's the process of copying. If you copy something sensible, you're not making a mistake. What's stupid is to mimic like a monkey. You know, a monkey, if you give it a glass, you may think it's thinking. No, that's mimicking. But in human experience, copying selectively makes sense. And here I want to mention in passing, the general has just talked about the borders, for example, that he identified a river in East Africa whose name he was not satisfied with. And he was beginning a job to make the name of that river changed to the local name. I thought when he spoke, he triggered a thinking process in me. Because we all in this room, ladies and gentlemen, your highnesses, the biggest lake in the world is in Africa. And that lake does not have an African name. That lake is millions of years old, geologically. But why should it carry a name of a woman, of a colonial power that came in the 18th century to conquer Africa? Because sometimes talking intellectual matters remains up in the air. But let's ask ourselves, we all Africans, don't begin saying it's Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. It's not their affair. It is a global continental issue. You carry names on your head. I am James. Who told you you're James? Since when? Maybe those people who gave names had a meaning behind it. A name like mine, Namboka, has a meaning. Now, I've seen people call themselves Spoon because it's in English. I'm serious on issues of names. And the general caused me to think about that. I was a little bit off my speech. It is the concern with African identity and respect for African history that I cite this white man, because he's Afrocentric. You need to be Afrocentric, particularly us Africans. See things as an African would see them. We've been taught to see things in the world the way those who colonized us see them. And I think that's a pity. So for me, someone who could be from India, from Japan, from Jamaica, from, I don't know, Antigua. Fortunately, sir, I had a stint in Antigua, maybe you now know. We should appreciate value from wherever it comes from. We need allies in this battle to bring Africa to dignity, as we had before. So I mentioned this man because he has written a book. This book is entitled The Black Kingdom of the Nile. And the Black Kingdom of the Nile is to contradict people who thought only Egypt up there in Africa could possibly have kingdoms and pharaohs. This is the English translation of the original French title, Les Pharaons Noirs, the black pharaohs, the African pharaohs. This man decided, as an archaeologist and an Egyptologist, not to do research in Egypt, because everybody is thinking about Egypt is close to the Mediterranean Sea, therefore there might be some blood from Europe that made Egyptians make those great things. He went down to Sudan, down farther to the equator. And for 56 years, he was excavating with the latest technological equipment. And he discovered what he has documented here. And it made me so proud to give my support to His Majesty King Tanyi when he was planning this project. Africans must rediscover our greatness, our value. we must be made to understand that we are descendants of extraordinary power. The power that overran Egypt and for 100 years ruled over Egypt. So this man, I'm going to say a little bit about him. He is following the footsteps of Sheikh Anta Diop. However, he introduces a radically new approach for refuting the racist, white supremacist, Eurocentric bias, which only seeks to limit the study of Africa on Egypt. So he got down to sub-Saharan Africa, he researched, and he has brought out evidence. So he has unearthed relics of indomitable pharaohs of the Nubian Empire who lived there about 700 years before Jesus was born. These men fought and defeated Egypt and ruled it, as I said, for 700 years. That was the 25th dynasty of the Black Pharaohs. So I thought I brought a set of books, and I have 45 PowerPoint slides to concretely show. We're not going to see them here, but we are here until Sunday. Those who really feel interested in seeing vividly, I will have that material. The books are not many enough to distribute to everybody, but I have only 8 copies. With these 8 copies, I'm pleading. We talked about education. Have our children receive the right information about our ancestors. People who happen to be in the field of teaching, culture, leading opinions, I'm quite happy to share those documents with them. And the electronic version of my presentation and the 45 slides, PowerPoint slides, I'll share with them. Let us spread this pride that was hidden from us. Now, that prepares us as Africans, having known what we were, the greatness that was on the continent, to what colonialism brought. This brings us to the colonial governance time in Africa. Ostensibly, Europeans forcefully established their rule over Africa for the benefit of Africans, who were perceived as primitive savages without any form of civilization. But from the foregoing, what I've been saying, it's quite clear that Africa was everything except what the Europeans claim. But because they believed in that, they came, and with the force, they unscrupulously and brutally used ruse, that's trickery, and from the very early contacts with Africans, started to sabotage whatever was on the continent. One very ancient king in the Congo, Mwami, who called himself Henry I, because the Europeans came and told him, yes, you're very spiritual, we will associate you with our church, you're very strong. By the way, even today, Africa is the biggest Christian community. The population of people who are religious, it's on the continent of Africa, because we are naturally spiritual, but we are genuinely spiritual. It's different from the pretenders who say they are spiritual, but they are not. So this king of Congo in the 15th century fell victim and agreed to be the brother of the Christian king of Portugal. But after a while, he had to write to the king and told him, my brother king, whatever, the king of, I don't have the name of the king in Portugal, the king of Congo said, I don't want this practice of stealing my people, capturing them, taking them away, and destroying my population. I want it stopped, because he believed he was talking to a brother. This is how proud the African man was, writing to this European king in Europe. In fact, I've heard in the story anecdote that in Uganda, when the European came, the Kabaka, the king who was there, told those who came to bring the message from England that if you have a queen instead of a king, I want to marry that girl. Oh yes, so this was the attitude of the men and the women who were in control in Africa. The king in Uganda said, yes, bring that Queen Elizabeth, Victoria, I will marry her. That kind of confidence has gone, regrettably. So this king of Congo told the king of Portugal, stop this nonsense or I don't want any business with you. 2 months after, there was a threat on his life when he was in church. They wanted to kill him. You raise your voice, you go. But history is here, that he challenged slaving and taking away people from the continent. For those who think our kings gave away our brothers and sisters, it was forcing, stealing. Now, the king, on receiving the king's letter, this is what the king in Portugal replied. The king said, even if we took so many more, your kingdom is so highly populated. Now, this kind of insolence, there is no humanity in that. And that is an anecdote about how the European kings treated our kings then. So, European political tactics and exercise of power in Africa has not changed. It has in subsequent years, false friendship remained the same. Quite very often, violence physically was exercised, and this is why the new leaders of Africa, like Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Steve Biko, Muammar Gaddafi, were removed. Because you can't be speaking for your people. You should be a friend. Well, we know that in the case of South Africa, apartheid was established, nobody denied it, and of course it led to the ANC movement, as we heard this morning. But Mandela was imprisoned for 27 years, innocently. Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya was imprisoned 7 years for opposing the white supremacists. Now, when you say you're the people now that are going to teach human rights, if you are not informed, you'll say, yes, come and teach me. But when you've done what you've done to Kenyatta in Kenya and to Nelson Mandela in South Africa, then you disqualify yourself if you are coming to give me a message. But now, under colonial rule, this has been what is written down. It's not my words. The colonial political order and social system were designed to further imperial goals and were fully established and enforced by the 1940s, wherever the Europeans went. There were 5.5 million Kenyans in 1948. 5 million Africans in Kenya in 1948. At the same time, there were no more than 30,000 Europeans. 5.5 million Kenyans and 30,000 Europeans. That was less than a third. However, the 1% retained control of economic power, privilege, and political authority. The European community constituted a kind of high class or high caste, reminiscent to the long-defunct European aristocracies and occupied a highly privileged position in both the political and economic life of people in Kenya. That was then a colony. Colonial whites held a virtual monopoly of power, as they always held 27%, 25 seats out of the 39 positions on the Legislative Council in Kenya. This authority expressed itself in various forms, discriminating against the African population. In housing, in wages, in education, and in public service. This political rule was, of course, rooted in the settlers' economic dominance of Kenya. The settlers had acquired and legally maintained exclusive rights to the best land of the country, the areas known as the White Highlands. Overall, the British policy was, in the words of Charles Eliot, one of the important white administrators then, that Kenya was a white man's country. Now, for those who have heard about the Kenyan road to independence, will have heard about the Mau Mau rebellion against colonial rule. When you go to a country and you do what the whites did there, then you get what they got. The men and women of Kenya rose and had to fight for years until they became free. Now, of course, it didn't stop in Kenya. Samora Machel and Eduardo Mondlane of the Frelimo in Mozambique, President Marian Ngwabi and Robert Mugabe had leadership that got through a lot of trouble. These men had to fight. Now, similarly, colonial governments and policies in Rhodesia, which is Zimbabwe today, is known to those who have been interested since the unilateral declaration of independence by Mr. Ian Smith. So when you talk about colonial administration, I think I've given you what the picture was. And I think that should be enough. And let's now turn to post-colonial governance. With the post-colonial administration, we had one French writer, an agronomist, René Dumont, who wrote A False Start in Africa. That was in 1965. This man feared that as an agricultural continent, Africans were starting their independence, but on the wrong foot. They were emulating too much of what the Europeans do, whereas Africa is a very different setting. Well, he may not have been right, but the false start the author was thinking about more or less became clearer as we go about looking at how we are performing against what was done against us before. Now, this man wrote this exactly. Governance in Africa had better be based on African needs and African dreams. But we've been made to follow the World Bank and IMF dream. We tend to follow. You can lay off people because the motive is profit, not the people's service. And this conference here is saying, let us stop, think, and look back. So evaluating the performance of post-colonial states in Africa against governance criteria makes us realize that we've got things to adjust, because governance is the overall complex system of frameworks of processes, functions and structures, rules of law and norms, born out of relations, interactions, dynamics, and communication within a society. And this can apply to a small group as it can be applied to a nation. So when we begin to evaluate our own, most states today, after shaking off the yoke of colonial rule, have slackened in economic performance. Infrastructure, maintenance, and social services have become weaker, sometimes completely dysfunctional. Poverty, unemployment, and democratic political practices and external debt problems live with us today. That's now, after the colonial period, we're trying to do a job, but these problems are with us today. Human rights being the interrelated and inseparable matter that weaves throughout our lives, if you check our governance manners today, we do not fulfill what we set out to give our people. Poverty leads to social vulnerability, political myopia and impatience or impotence, economic exploitation, poor health, and social marginalization are problems most of us, even our own government, are trying to fight. Peace has eluded many nations, and recurring conflicts, which often turn into civil wars, induce internal conflicts, like the story of Liberia, which had a 14-year civil war, have happened after independence. The above description applies to many countries where life is just bearable for most citizens, but comfortable for only a few. There are, at the same time, cases such as South Sudan, Somalia, and the DRC, which have been through a lot of difficulty recently of survival. The dissatisfaction I mention here has led to the recent rising of the young men in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, because things are not running the way the societies want. This conference of traditional leaders is partly inspired by what the young people are asking us to do. Can we stay with our arms crossed, or must we come and contribute and support our friends who are in power today? This is the observation on the current leadership and the challenges we have on the continent. And now, boys, young people are taking over, even without following the constitutions. So we are saying that we need to look at our own road so far, and the elders of the continent who have not been engaged in the real day-to-day running of this continent want to join hands with those of our brothers and sisters in power to work together. But youth is key. Youth, the generation which is our children and our grandchildren, wants to see Africa rebirth. And this is what animated the conference, the colloquium in Dakar in June. These elders are saying Africa is disappearing. We are dying, we are drowning. And so we are here. We have done what I would have called a critique of what we have as today's business in Africa, in governance terms. So what can we do? I think what follows is more or less what has been said since yesterday. Our sister from the African Union Commission of Human Rights, underlining the human rights, has said, yes, we must do things better. And the kings and queens of the continent are here to say, this is how we want to do things better. How? This is the discussion we are going to have after this presentation. In my view, I know that you can have one or two or three options to follow. My first proposal is that we prioritize human rights. This is the rule, the golden rule. As Africans, civilians or civil society or people in power have to get together and say, we are the inventors of the golden rule. Do things that you would want others do to you when you're in power. Only do the kind of things you'd want others do to you. That is an African adage saying. So first, let us go ethical, respect morality, respect humanity. The general from the Caribbean said Ubuntu. I nearly jumped when he brought the word Ubuntu, because that is the key word from this continent. People who run state affairs must be human. That's Ubuntu, the golden rule. Never do things that you wouldn't want anybody to do to you. If we go back to that, we've got all the wealth there is in the world. There will be no corruption. There will be no killing of somebody because he doesn't agree with you. So first, let's go ethical. This is what the strength of our traditional leaders can offer and accompany our new leaders. Two, we need to make science a key to the solving problems. We seem to be like people who want to drive at night but don't want traffic, they don't want the lights on the car. If you don't want lights on the car, don't drive at night. Because science really is the key, is the weapon. But our leaders have very often sidelined knowledge. Professionals, again the general spoke. I'm sorry, I really respect the general because he's my friend. We are in the same bracket of age. We have to leave legacy. When people say science is vital and we don't listen, we are saying, I don't want to see where I'm going, but I'm going. Leadership today must go down to science. Invest big money from your national budget into the youth, and then make the youth learn the thing they ought to learn. Undo the lies, teach them self-respect. Allow me to tell you that I spent 5 years in the Caribbean, in Haiti, that great nation, the first black nation in the world to be independent, beating off the European masters. But when I was in Haiti, what I saw about the descendants of Africa there, they are militant Africans. You see, when you're on the continent, it's awful, it's you take it for granted. But when you've been through slavery, 400 years, to just imagine you belong somewhere free makes them wonderful. And when we go there, we are taken like angels. So we must not disappoint. But we need to be based on knowledge. And Africa must be receiving the right knowledge about ourselves and about those of us who are taken away. I had the rare opportunity, 2022, to be in Antigua and Barbuda for a week. These people are as good as you can see the general. They literally lifted me when I said I'm from the continent. They look like us, but they wish they could come here. And you can see how so happy, even though yesterday he shed a tear of joy. There is a difference. The general, he's a general in the army, but yesterday he broke down out of joy. I hope I'm not misrepresenting. We must accept science, we must know more, and invest in the right area. That, for me, is my suggestion. And to conclude, I was asked by this old man, I said we must respect our elders. This old man, who is not an African, but who has known how Africa is trodden over and despised, says, let us seek to promote the study of knowledge, of science, and in archaeology and anthropology, and get the truth dug out. Because most of Africa south of the Sahara has not been investigated, because they don't want to reveal the kind of things he has revealed. So, if I go to give the book out to friends, it will be people who strike me as determined to go and, excuse me, get the young people who are now in the process of education, future scientists of Africa, to pursue the things these men have achieved. I think with your clemency, I will stop here because we are going to have a discussion. And I'm not a shy boy. When I'm asked questions, I'll look you in the eyes and try to answer without bitterness. I'm very grateful, Your Majesties, the kings, the queens present, the princesses and princes, distinguished delegates, the officials of the government of this great kingdom of Eswatini. I would be failing miserably if I didn't put on record my personal gratitude that we are received in the fatherly way we have been received. I call it fatherly. This is the beginning of hospitality. We should be teaching the world hospitality. To host this august assembly and bring in all foreigners, they didn't tell us if you don't have a visa, you don't enter. This is Africa. We were allowed to come in just like this. I acknowledge that, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I respect and adore the initiative of His Majesty Dr. Robinson Tanyi for building this project of African people getting together and talking to each other. I thank you very much. Thank you.
I think this august house can do much better than. Can we make big work? Thank you. Those of us that do share a platform with His Excellency Ambassador Namboka, even as kings, that's why in our kingdoms we keep such elders so that we tap that wisdom. Whenever he speaks, you could see that in our kingdoms, we must keep the elders so that they change and also transfer that knowledge from generation to generation. And that is the task that we have as the kings of Africa. May I start with an announcement? There is a delegate that has wrongfully picked his or her bag, and that bag has a person's different belongings. There is also a notebook that has an initial written on it. So please, let's check our bags so that I know they look the same. Sorry. This one is mine. But is it yours? Oh, okay. Please, let's check our bags so that we may give the rightful bag to the rightful owner. Your Excellency Namboka, that was a very, very powerful presentation. We thank you. And I also want to echo and also recommend General Ambassador Chief. At times I don't know which title to call Ambassador Williams. He has maybe even 10 of them. I don't know which should come first. Most of the times that we meet the ambassador, William, there's that emotional all over, even in Zambia when we have this session. And that's why we are very happy today that as traditional rulers of Africa, we have agreed that we must change the narration of Africa, and especially our colleagues in the diaspora, the 6th region. Ambassador, the next time, do not leave Dr. Melinda. I think the women folk also, they need to tap that assertiveness. We really need whenever you are traveling. She's another very powerful lady. I think I have also learned something on the names. In Zambia, for example, the colonial masters have reduced us from kings to chiefs. All of us, that is a total demotion. And that's why for me, I do not call myself Chief Ishima. If you see my title, I am called Dr. Mwanta Ishima. Mwanta is the Lunda word to mean a king. Why should we be reduced to like a chief inspector? That is dehumanizing. So the challenge to you, Your Royal Highnesses, Your Majesties, it is time like you behave from this. We must decolonize Africa. We must rewrite our history so that it is written in our African, in an Afrocentric, not Eurocentric. That is what we want. Look at the books. Those of you who are coming from Zimbabwe and Zambia, the books are saying Dr. Livingstone is the first person to see the what? The Victoria Falls. But that is not right. There were already people there. And in our local language, it's called Naluamba Chungura Mtritima, is it? So it is not right to be cheating us to say Dr. Livingstone is the first person to see the Victoria Falls. We need to change the syllabus of our educational system. That is a must. And that's why we need to involve and engage our governments. We need to be learning our own history, not about Christopher Columbus, or what, or maybe the legs of the Injas ropers. Yes, that helps, but in this modern day, let us bring in history that would move us to the Africa that we want. And also one thing that Ambassador Namboka, you have interested us as traditional leaders. We are, as kings and queens of Africa, being demonized to say we are witchcraft and wizards. I can tell you that is long gone. Those of you who in Zambia attended the Kings of Kings event, we are born again Christians. Amen. In the interest of time, if I was going to lay hands on you, you will see how the demons were going to fly out of you. So, this issue of science, yes, Ambassador Namboka, to Your Royal Highnesses, is there. But us as traditional rulers, I know others can fly to London in 2 minutes. But let us change this science to modern science. this science use the correct type of fuel. I think you have a challenge that is on your desk as kings and queens of Africa, because why don't we use this science to develop Africa in the way we want? We are able to do strange things, but our science is hidden. So to all the traditional leaders here, please let us embrace science in order to solve the African problems with African solutions. Thank you very much. Can we prepare for lunch? God bless you all.